what we need to do is to restore, allow the life of our planet to come to full fruition, allow human communities to redevelop their sense of agency and locality, and to include all of the things we love, not just the possibility of a very narrow definition of prosperity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of The Conscious Capitalists with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hey there, Raj.
Hey, Timothy. Good to see you again, as always.
Yes, good to see you. And today, we have a very special guest. We have Vincent Stanley, who's co-authored with Yvon Chouinard, The Responsible Company. And as importantly, he's written that book from the perspective of someone who's been with Patagonia almost since the beginning in 1973. And for many of those years, he was in key executives roles as head of sales or marketing. And more informally, he's Patagonia's longtime chief storyteller. He developed the Footprint Chronicles, the company's interactive website that outlines the social and environmental impact of its products, the Common Threads Partnership, and Patagonia Books. He currently serves as the company's director of Patagonia Philosophy, and he's a visiting fellow at the Yale School of Management. And he's also a poet whose work has appeared in the Best American Poetry. And he and his wife, the writer Nora Gallagher, live in Santa Barbara and in Maine, where he's been bragging about the blueberries in Maine. Hey, Vincent, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
So good to have you, and the voice of experience and carrying the storytelling role at Patagonia, which we think is so important. And you've got a book that's come out that's an important book, The Responsible Company. And maybe begin with what you mean by responsible company. What do those words mean to you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Actually, the first edition of The Responsible Company came out about 12 years ago. And we revised it with a new title, The Future of the Responsible Company, in order to reflect both the changes in the company in the last 12 years, and then also because I work a lot with students, with graduate students, to help them imagine the possibilities in business for their working lives. It's interesting, when we chose the term to describe the responsible company, we were trying to avoid the word sustainable. And the reason we were trying to avoid the word sustainable is when we looked at our own activities as a business, we felt that there was almost nothing we did that really is sustainable. That sustainable means that you're actually giving back to the earth as much or more than you're taking. And we thought that the word sustainable used in business misleads people to the extent that people start to think if you're making practices that improve your social and ecological performance, that you're actually being sustainable when you're not. But everyone can be responsible. And we've opened up both editions of the book with a quote from a Heisler leader in British Columbia, Gerald Amos, who says the most important right we have is the right to be responsible. And we love this quote because it takes it away from the idea of responsibility as kind of a burden, something you do when you're not having fun, to something that is, deeply connected to human agency and satisfaction. So when we launched the book about 12 years ago at Yale, Bob Massey, who's been involved in sustainable business efforts for 30 years, said, it's interesting that you wouldn't use that word, because sustainable is the word we started to use in the 1960s to imply that businesses could do more than just be responsible. So we've come full circle. The new word that a lot of people are using, and we think it's a good one, though it can be misused as easily as any other, is regenerative. And one of the things that has struck me is that in order for an activity to be sustainable, it really does have to be regenerative. It has to contribute to the ongoing process rather than be extractive or polluting.
Yeah. Well, I love that because you can put them together and say, we want you to be a responsible and regenerative business.
Yeah, yeah.
And and how would you begin to identify those? Because I know that when you have, say those words, and when I was over in the UK, we did some surveys about people wanting to work with those kind of businesses. And 85% of people will say, I want to work with a responsible regenerative business, but they find them really hard to identify or to be able to sort out who is really being responsible and regenerative. So I'm curious when we press a little bit and say, how do you know a responsible and regenerative business? How do you make that judgment?
Well, again, there, I think we'd have to make a distinction between responsible and regenerative, because I think you can find a lot of companies that are, or many companies that are responsible and more companies that engage in responsible activities. Regenerative is a high bar, and Patagonia doesn't meet it, not for our apparel company. We started a small food company about 10 years ago, and there we discovered that if you actually help rebuild the soil through regenerative practices and organic practices, there you can be truly regenerative and you can be truly sustainable. But for the clothing business, we use industrial processes, very traditional. Most of the actions that we undertake are to reduce the harm we do rather than to be regenerative. And, customers don't get much information that's reliable. Most customers are, well, all of us are, I forget how many advertising messages we're hit with every day, but it's very difficult to really find out the comparative ecological or social benefits of the piece of furniture you're buying or a piece of clothing. It's getting a little better in food. So it's difficult. It takes work, and it's difficult for a company. Every time we undertake some new activity to source something differently in a better way, it takes a huge amount of research, and it usually takes a lot of work to undo the system and rejigger it so that you can, for instance, with wetsuits that traditionally have used neoprene, which relies on limestone. So we use a plant-based material to make wetsuits, but when you do that, you disconnect yourself from the entire industry standard for making wetsuits, and you have to reinvent everything. So this is not easy work.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting and related to that, and you sort of touched on it, which is the hope that we're going to have more conscious consumers, and the idea that there's a movement towards more conscious buying or more awareness on that side. But you just pointed out the conundrum of the role of trying to educate your consumers around this, and how do you balance that with, we're here to sell a product, and sometimes to really get the full value of what we're doing, we've got to really educate you on this neoprene versus the biodegradable kind of approach that we're taking.
Well, in some ways, it's fortunate for us because we've been delivering the same messages for decades, and our business model is now built around the innovations that we create environmentally and the social practices. So it's not a compromise. I mean, people expect that from us, and it's what we do well. So in terms of our company, we're okay. I think in terms of what we need as a society and what we need as human beings in the decades ahead, we're going to need a much stronger level of cooperation among consumers, businesses, and government to actually deliver meaningful information that's also accurate. It's not just on the consumer to buy intelligently. It's really on us producers to clean up, at minimum, clean up our act, to not do things to the environment or to human beings that don't need to be done in order to make our products. And ideally, to actually create products and offer services that help solve the environmental and social problems that we have.
You know, Vincent, we of course all long admired Patagonia for so many reasons. It really is a poster child company for us in conscious capitalism as a paragon of what we talk about. And one of the great distinctive elements, I think, about Patagonia is the commitment to the truth. It's not spinning, it's not making up things. It's telling the truth as it is. And also telling, I think somewhere I read that telling the same story to all stakeholders. So you don't have a different message for customers and a different message for employees and investors and so forth. And that creates a lot of trust. As you say, it creates strategic commitment, momentum, and this phrase that caught my eye, difficulty in backing away from your initiatives. When you communicate in that way, could you talk a little bit about how that dynamic works, how it creates some kind of like positive pressure to stay on the path?
Well, it's interesting. The word integrity, has two meanings. One is that you do what you say you're going to do, but it also means that in engineering or talking about structures, it means that the structure has integrity. And I think that there's a reason that word has those two meanings. What happens when you create expectations among your stakeholders, your customers, your employees, the communities you work in, your suppliers, if you tell the same message, your stakeholders are expecting that behavior from you. And when you vary from that, they're going to tell you. They're going to remind you. And that's happened time and again for us. Sometimes we regret being so forthright because then our employees say, well, are we really living up to our commitments when we're undertaking such and such action? It's interesting to me also that when we sometimes talk about very large companies that have made pretty bold statements in the past, Danone with the leadership of Emmanuel Faber, Unilever with the leadership of Paul Pullman, and even at times with Walmart, going back to 2007, of large companies making big commitments and then backing off. What we also find is that doesn't disappear from the culture. Once you engage human beings in an activity in which their most deeply held values come into play, then that enters the culture. And I think it's almost impossible to drive it out. And what we've seen from a company like Walmart is it has retreated from some of its stated environmental goals. But then, 5 or 6 years later, a new CEO will come in and they'll renew the commitment. So I think I only say that. I don't recommend that backing off, but I say that for people who feel like, well, we're gonna undertake this activity. We're gonna make a change in our culture, but history shows us that people back down from that and they go to the bottom line. And I want to tell people that I think it's always worth the effort. That once something is done, it's there for other people to revisit and also to inspire them to action in the future.
That's one thing I think that Patagonia has really shown, the approach to engaging with so-called competitors and trying to bring about a shift in other companies. It's not just about what you do in Patagonia. Patagonia is a successful company, but it's still relatively small compared to companies like Walmart and others. And therefore, I think Yvon Chouinard's approach of saying, if I can influence them even a little bit, that'll have a bigger impact on the world than everything that we do. And I think that is something that is really I think a responsibility of a company at the cutting edge, who's trying to be at the cutting edge, right? So again, you're kind of paving, or you're hacking through the jungle or whatever, you're creating a path. And having others follow you, I think, is a bigger measure of success. Could you talk a little bit about that, like some of the things that were inspired at other companies as a result of efforts at Patagonia?
There have been several movements in the last 10 or 15 years, including conscious capitalism, including the B Corp movement, of people who, in business, who recognize the uses of business, because business is, as a social actor compared to government and NGOs, is the most nimble, the best at deploying resources. And so if we actually apply our creativity, our knowledge and our strengths to helping to make the world a better place, then I think we earn our social license. I think we are very much committed to providing a model for businesses like ourselves who want to act on their deepest values and who primarily want to do something well. They want to make a good product. They want to have a good impact on their communities. This is not a negative zero-sum game. This is an activity of recognizing the world we live in, its problems, its possibilities, and then saying, okay, how do we actually go forward and solve problem X, or how do we understand that the problems are very Pope Francis referred to. He said, it looks like we have a social crisis on the one hand of inequality, and an ecological crisis on the other hand of threatening the future of the earth. But it's really one crisis with two faces. Once we start to recognize that, and once we start to recognize that the model of industrial capitalism that we followed for 200 years no longer works, so we have to take what we've learned and figure out how to change that model so that it actually serves human beings and the environment. So that's kind of where Patagonia's commitment is to say, okay, if you talk about telling the truth, let's acknowledge the world as it is and talk about how do we create a culture within our own company that makes it possible to create products and offer services that create a lot of change. And then how do we inspire others if we're successful? Because we have to be successful as a business in order to be credible.
I love the example you have of the campaign for Don't Buy This Coat, right? And, it sort of, it did exemplify your commitment to responsible consumption and environmentalism. What are the implications of that for you as a business? I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive. Don't buy this coat. It catches everyone's attention. It's integrity with your brand. And at the same time, you do want to sell coats. How do you reconcile those seemingly contradictory elements?
Well, it's an interesting example. We took out this ad in the New York Times in 2011 and said, don't buy this jacket. And the headline was arresting. It had been, that was part of the idea. But what the ad went on to say, and this goes back to what we were talking about originally, like the difference between sustainability and responsibility, is we chose a jacket that was at that time kind of a paragon of ecological responsibility. It was 40% recycled polyester that at the end of this product's life, we would take it back and melt down the polyester and make a jacket of equal value. We talked about all of the strengths of this, and then we pointed out and we said, listen, still this jacket generates 2/3 of its weight in scrap. It generates 23 times its weight in greenhouse gases. And therefore, it's really important for us not only to make it responsibly, but also to sell it responsibly. And it's important for the customer to buy products that you need and that you're going to use, and not to treat this in a cavalier fashion. And apparel is kind of a notorious market for that, the greatest moment of satisfaction a lot of people have when they buy a piece of clothing is when they put their credit card across the counter. Once that desire is satisfied, then the clothing doesn't mean much. We're trying to change that so that the primary experience human experience you have with that piece of clothing is satisfaction that you've been able to use it for a long time for things that you love to do. So I think that's the deeper message of Don't Buy This Jacket, which is a more kind of a positive response. Say, what is our relationship to our things, and how do we improve that in order to make it more humanly satisfying and also give something back to the world better than we're used to giving.
Well, one of the things that's been really noticeable about Patagonia recently is the change in ownership and the shift to the two different not-for-profit entities, one a purpose trust and one a charitable trust. But in that process, you're the first business that is really out there for the earth. And, the board of directors has to ask that question. What would Mother Earth want around this decision? And I'm curious how that's impacted your looking at performance numbers. So how in the end do you start saying, hey, we're for the earth and we're performing well? Or how does that dialogue begin to look?
There's a long story involved in changing the ownership, but one of the things we did before we changed the ownership was to change the mission statement. And the mission statement for a long time had been build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. I remember when that was adopted, I thought, oh my God, that is so aspirational. I was sales manager at the time, and I thought, there's not much about what we really do in this mission statement. But it turned out I became a believer, because what I saw was, rather than this statement just become plaque on the wall and that you close the door against, it was something that the employees took to heart. And people, almost everybody, they couldn't repeat that word for word because it was a mouthful, but they knew each of those three clauses. And they would, in the course of designing products, or in the course of changing systems, or in the course of selling, people would pay attention to that. When we decided to make the change to in the mission statement, we simplified it to we're in business to save our home planet. We did that for two reasons. It raised the bar again, because that's a highly aspirational statement for the consumer products company. But we thought that the environmental crisis had not really come into full consciousness over the 30 years since we had adopted our mission statement. And second, we'd gotten into the food business, and we discovered the potential to be regenerative. And in fact, with the food business, every product that we introduce has to solve some problem in the food system or in agriculture. So that's really strictly the business model. So we didn't want to just say cause no unnecessary harm, which I think was a very legitimate clause for the clothing business. So we've changed the mission statement, and again, what I see are the employees taking this to heart. How does this change the way I do business? And when we changed the ownership when the Chenards basically gave the company to these trusts, I think we created a structure that was in line with that mission statement. But we're still a product. The focus is still on products, and the high quality products, maybe even improving the quality of those products so that they have a longer life and they have a longer sales cycle. Maybe 2 or 3 owners can own a jacket rather than just one. So everything that we do in the process of making those products has to keep in mind that we're in business to help save our home planet. But those two things are in tandem. And it also goes, I think there's been I think for all of us who've been involved with this for a while, we understand that the long-term interests of business often coincide with social and environmental gains. The short-term interests of business often does not. So what you have when you're talking about running a business in which you're always looking to help save our home planet, you're looking at that long-term gain for both.
Yeah, I love that. And it points out to your earlier question about in a sense, we've developed an economic system based on some 19th century ideas, rather than about anything on science, nor about the health of humanity, nor about the health of our planet. And when you start to put it in terms of whatever system of economics that we have for organizing and producing products, it's almost weird that it would be in contradiction to creating thriving communities, humanity thriving, and our planet prospering. And it's basically kind of a weird concept that we have this other idea that it's just about this thing called money and not about people and not about the health of our planet. When you sit back and you look at that, well, what's our path forward here? How do we start to make that movement real for businesses without losing the power of business? Because it's an incredibly powerful organizing framework that capitalism has provided us with.
If you go back to 18th century economics and you go back to Adam Smith, you see that they were really concerned about the value of economic activity and the benefit. And it's only really in the past 100 years, 2 things happened. One is that in economics, we started to associate value exclusively with price. And that has led to a kind of dehumanizing of our ideas about economics. But also we became victims of our own success. Human beings created this extraordinary capacity. A jet plane has 700,000 horsepower, right? So what we've been able to do as a species is extraordinary. But now what we need is a level of humility to say, okay, we've created an economy that works brilliantly for 1/3 of the population in the United States that's college educated, not so brilliantly for most other people. We've denigrated and torn apart cultures rather than enrich them. So how do we take as you raise the question, the power of what we've been able to do, but attach to it a new humility, saying, okay, we're not this. It's almost the opposite of what Elon Musk would recommend about building a city of 1 million on Mars. What we need to do is to restore, allow the life of our planet to come to full fruition, allow human communities to redevelop their sense of agency and locality, and to include all of the things we love, not just the possibility of a very narrow definition of prosperity.
I love that, Vincent. And this is where I think your identity as a philosopher and a poet becomes really interesting, right? Because we do need, in a way, our own Copernican revolution in the world of business. Right? For
Yes.
Copernicus, the
Yeah.
earth was the
Yeah.
center of the universe, everything revolved around that.
Yeah.
And in business, we have put profit at the center. And everything, including people and the planet and communities and everything, revolves around profit, right? If it adds to profit, you do it. If it doesn't matter. And like you, I believe we need to put not just people, but life at the center. So it's people, it's the planet and all of its systems, and of course, other species with whom we share the planet. We're going through a mass extinction right now, caused by human activity. Right? So I'm interested to explore your role as a philosopher, or how did you come to this work into the world of business? And how do you blend philosophy, poetry, and the pursuit of business? What's your pathway, really, I think is what I'm asking. What shaped you into the kind of thinker and leader that you are?
My own, because I was vocationally a writer from very early on. And so a lot of the people, I'm influenced by the people that I read, and I was also grew up in the 1960s. So I grew up with an understanding of upheaval and also of idealism. But I think the interesting thing about Patagonia is that it was not founded as a clothing company, but as a mountain climbing equipment company. And there, I think the ethics of climbing have been foundational for the company. It's interesting. We run on-site childcare in Ventura and in Reno. And the true things that we really try to develop for the kids are, one, a sense of self-reliance, and two, really great socialization, play well with others. And those two things are absolutely required for climbing. The other thing that happens with being outside is once you get a little bit away from the road, your relation to the rest of the universe changes. You feel more self-reliant, and you also feel more vulnerable. You also feel more humble. So I think those values have driven Yvon Chouinard from the beginning. And they've also become cultural values of the company, because so many of the employees were surfers and climbers and came out of that world. So I think that has influenced the company as primarily coming out of that particular branch of sport activity, of surfing, climbing, non-motorized, traveling through nature, playing with its forces, etc.
And yet at the same time, you've been I remember a phrase that early in the conscious capitalism movement, we came down and spent a day down at Patagonia with Casey Sheehan when he was CEO. And I remember somebody making the comment, we want to make the best raincoat in the world and the best for the planet. And what struck me at the time was, you're a high performance culture. Like, you have high standards, and people can fall into oh, isn't that lovely? Surf's up, we go surfing. Oh, isn't that lovely? We have childcare on campus. And at the same time, you want to make the best raincoat. You don't want it to be second best. You want it to be better than your competitors. And I'm curious, because so many people see this as an either or. And what I love about Patagonia is that it's the best raincoat in the world and for the world. And how have you nurtured that? It was one thing when there were 10 of you or 20 of you. It's another thing when there's several thousands of you. How have you nurtured that practically in the organizations?
It's an ongoing struggle, but the value there, well, there are two things. One is it helps keep company honest. If we're making a jacket for the most difficult kind of climbing in the most difficult conditions, we're honoring the highest human elements of that sport. If we're making the highest quality product, we're also making one that will be the most durable, and that will be the most environmentally beneficial. So a funny story. We made in the early middle 2000s. We made a line of eco rain shelves, and they were very boardy. They made noise when you walked in them. They weren't comfortable, and they didn't keep the rain out. So we looked at that and we said, all we're doing is creating products that people can say no to and say, oh my God, I'm not going to buy anything with eco on it because it doesn't perform. So we reestablished the principle that anything we made had performance came first. But if that performance created an environmental problem, we weren't going to shy away from that. We were going to try and resolve that as soon as we could.
And how did you come to know Yvon Chouinard? How did that connection first happen? How did that synergy start to develop between you?
He's my uncle.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The first thing I ever did for him is, as an employee, when I was 6 years old, and he was extending the shed in which he made his climbing gear by about 10 feet, and I held the plumb line. So,
oh, nice.
Keep it in the family. Keep it in the family.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Just a quick reminder that this episode is sponsored by the 2024 Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit. Are you ready to transform your business into a powerful force for good while connecting with world-class leaders shaping the future of business? Then you need to be at the 2024 CEO Summit. It's happening in October in Austin, and the CEO Summit is an exclusive invite-only experience for conscious leaders ready to claim their seat at the table. To request an invite or to nominate a peer, head to ceosummit.consciouscapitalism.org. That's ceosummit.consciouscapitalism.org, or check the episode show notes. Look forward to seeing you in October in Austin.
When I came to work for Patagonia, I only intended to stay about 6 months. It wasn't Patagonia, it was still Chouinard Equipment, and that was the year we created it. And then I really loved building this business, which was a surprise for me, but yeah.
You were also an avid climber?
No, I never was. I was always focused on sort of building a business I could believe in. It wasn't like, it didn't help me, support me in term as a climber or surfer.
So a good part of our audience are mid-sized CEOs who are looking at Patagonia and sort of saying, God, I love that company. What can I do now? What can I do differently today or in the next 12 months? What advice do you give to those kinds of CEOs of small, medium-sized businesses that are starting to grow and want to look at you guys as a role model? What are some of the practical 2 or 3 things that you give them advice on?
Yeah, well, I think that, just to create kind of the largest context, there's a quote from Aldo Leopold I love, and he was the first great land conservationist in the U.S., and he said a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And by that, he meant everything. When we think about that, that seems so instinctually true. And at the same time, we know that most of what we do for a living tends to disrupt the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. That's the tendency. So I think for a CEO or for people in leadership, it's important to keep that in mind. So this is the crux of the problem. How do we create products, offer services that are actually going to reverse that trend, or are going to advance that trend of tending to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community? And then the second thing I think about is that the best thing a business can do is to actually create products that solve problems or that meet that Leopold standard. And then the minimum, I think, that we should all be doing, and this often tends to tie us to reality rather than to our more aspirational work, is we need to be responsible for cleaning up after ourselves. And so if you're in the cement business, how do you do whatever you can to improve the environmental performance of cement? If you're in the apparel business as we are, what do you do to identify the harms that your economic activity produce, and then to minimize that and to replace it with regenerative activities when you can? So those three things, I think first you have to understand face the reality of the world, and then the second is to think big about how can my business really do positive benefit, and then the third is to make sure you're paying attention. There's another quote I came across. I love that, from Dwight Eisenhower, whose real talent was as a logistician in World War II. He's the one who put D-Day together. And he said, whenever I can't solve a problem, I make it bigger. He says, if I make it bigger, I can begin to see the outlines of a solution. If I make it too small, I can't begin to see it. And that's the role of leaders, is to look after the welfare of the whole enterprise in context, making that enterprise exercise welfare for the larger community.
Vincent, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is this fear and reality that there are companies that become conscious, have their consciousness awakened, they start adopting practices and philosophies like these, but then something happens, some external pressures or a change of leadership or something, and there's a backsliding, there's a loss of consciousness. It's not a one-way street where you can only grow in consciousness. Right? There's a number of companies I think we're looking at right now, which are, they're either under attack, like Unilever is, I think, under different leadership after Paul, succumbing to some of those pressures. Southwest Airlines seems to be under attack, losing some of what, I think it's a loss of soul in a way. And how do you preserve and safeguard that soul despite all of the external pressures? Now, those are publicly traded companies. There's a different dynamic there compared to what Patagonia has faced. But do you have any thoughts on how, because it's disheartening at one level when we are trying to build more awareness and practice of conscious capitalism, to see some of our exemplars start to backtrack, or backslide?
One thing that's very important for the long-term health of a conscious enterprise is the culture. What I've seen with Patagonia is that we've developed a level of cultural confidence that allows us to, rather than think about that how we make our money is a compromise between with doing good. I think that the profit, more and more, the profit emerges from what we do well. But that just takes a long time to do. And I think that the more that people have the permission within the culture to exercise their values, the more that gets baked into the culture, then you can survive backsliding, and you can survive, leadership changes that are unfortunate, because you have the capacity of the company to return to that after time. We talked about that a little bit at the start of a conversation. I think that's so important. One of the things that, John Elkington has issued a recall on the whole idea of triple bottom line, and I think it's partly because we haven't yet developed the metrics, we haven't yet developed tools that tell us really what our social and environmental impacts are. We don't consider social improvements as an investments. We consider them as expenses on the bottom line. There are all kinds of ways in which we operate that make it very difficult for an enterprise, particularly that's publicly traded and very large, to succeed in this new way. So, I think we have to identify the changes that have to be made, but also there are huge opportunities for building stronger cultures within companies, or more responsive cultures, partly because when you allow employees to exercise their values at work and exercise their imagination, and when decisions are made closer to the ground, you unlock kind of energy and dynamism that capitalism is famous for. So that what's good for the company can also be good for the planet in that way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue of how do you measure these quote unquote externalities. Raj is, famous for saying there are no such things as side effects,
Yeah, that's
there
true.
aren't,
Yeah.
but because we
Yeah.
don't measure them, we don't count them. And because we don't count them, then we don't have good profit. We don't know what true profit is because some of the expenses that we're incurring aren't showing up in numbers that we can look at and say, hey, that's a good profit.
Yeah. We at Patagonia, we have an environmental profit and loss sheet on every product we make, but it's not perfect. It doesn't have the depth or the heft that a P&L statement has just for the numbers alone, because you're making decisions. Okay, how do you identify a significant?
Yeah.
How do you even define a living wage? I mean, we pay a living wage, but there are lots of discussions on how you define that.
Well, switching gears a little bit, you've been involved with the Yale School of Management for a long time. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that make you optimistic as you work with younger people who are out, saying, I want to be in business, but I want to do it differently. Tell us a little bit about what that's been like for you.
No, it's wonderful. They're so smart. And they have social skills that my generation, didn't have. I work primarily with the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, which is a link. He actually started by students about 20 years ago between the environmental and the business schools. And then I also work with a lot of students from the Divinity School, and some from public health, and occasionally someone from the law school. I meet with them once a month, and we talk about what will be the big issues, the big social and environmental issues during your working life, and how do you think about this in relation to how you want to make your living. So that's maybe my favorite activity is engaging with them. And I see a tremendous amount of skill, intelligence, idealism, but it's deeper than that. It's like a real commitment, and they don't know how they're going to make a living. Often, it's not the easy jobs. Easy for them to find a job when they're coming out. Where are they going to go to work? And what kind of work are they going to do? The three areas I think I put this to. There's a whole chapter in the future of the responsible company I call "Making a Living in the Anthropocene," and and I was thinking about these students and talking about the potential for policy-making jobs in government, the need to radically transform agricultural practices, and what's already well underway is the whole electrification of the economy in order to create radical improvements in resource efficiency. I don't know that I'm particularly optimistic. I'm not a pessimist. Elon is, and he describes himself that way. But what I've seen...
As what? As an optimist or a pessimist?
A pessimist, yeah. And you can understand, he's a man who came of age in the 1950s as a climber and a surfer, and he's seen the degradation of the natural world for his whole life. But it never stopped him from acting. And almost in observing and learning from him, I really see that preserving a sense of agency is more important than optimism. And agency is what really gives us the sense that we are actually acting as human beings. So even if you, and pessimism is, both pessimism and optimism aren't really based in reality. They're just based in anxiety and anticipation. So it's the agency that actually creates the change. Here's another quote I love, which is, he says, anybody who doesn't believe in change has never worked with his hands. So that's a form of optimism. Yeah.
I like that, activism versus optimism versus pessimism. You channel whatever that energy is into activism, and whether you will see, like Gandhi was an activist, even though he didn't achieve his dreams in his lifetime, most of them, but he still acted towards them. I think that's the great thing that we can do. We have to think about the impact beyond our lifetime.
That's right. And if we hadn't had Gandhi, what would the world be like? I mean, that's the other thing. That's when people talk about the failures of the environmental movement. If we hadn't had the environmental movement, what would our rivers be like right now? What would our air quality be?
Well, as Gandhi also said, it's better to fail at something big and noble rather than succeed at something small and irrelevant. And another Indian spiritual teacher, Sadhguru, says, who's also trying to rejuvenate the soil. I mean, that's one of the big sort of hidden crises in some ways. The rate at which we're losing topsoil and degrading it. He said, I know I will die a failure, but I will die a blissful failure because I've tried and actually have made some difference. And I think that is something that Patagonia really exemplifies, doing everything possible, regardless of the odds.
Thank you. And this point about the soil is so important, because the soil this one of the areas where if we do it right as human beings, we can help nature recover much faster than she could on her own.
Yeah, and also the importance of stories. I mean, I love that you're sort of the keeper of the stories in some sense at Patagonia, because, that's how we inspire human beings, is through the stories we tell. And as you think of that role for yourself, what are some of your favorite stories that you like telling that capture the essence of Patagonia?
Well, I think the most important thing about storytelling is not the stories we tell, but the stories we experience. I think an illustration of that was when we made the switch to organic cotton, and we found out how harmful the chemicals were used in cotton cultivation, and Yvon made the decision to get out of the sportswear business unless he could go organic. And we were going to make that change in 18 months. So we all did our homework, and we bought all of the organic cotton being grown in the Central Valley. And then we discovered that, of course, when we bought from farmers, they had no relationship to mills, just no relationship to spinners who turned the fiber into yarn, or to the mills that turned it into fabric. And so all of a sudden, we're running around the world trying to find somebody to spin organic cotton, and they're all saying, we hate this stuff. It comes up our machines. And our employees are saying, listen, I'm going to do everything I did last year in terms of design and coloring and specs and showing it to the major customers. By the way, I have to find a whole new infrastructure for making cotton sportswear, raise my prices $5 to $10 on everything I sell, and not a single customer ever asked for this. So why are we the martyrs? And what we ended up doing, that I think is an illustration of storytelling as an experience, is we actually took the employees 40 at a time to the Central Valley in buses. And even before you got to the fields, you could smell the organophosphates that are used to prepare the plants. They were developed as nerve gases for World War II. If you dug your hands in the soil, it's not alive. It takes earthworms 5 years to come back after you stop spraying. There's no vegetation. And then we take them at the end of the day to an organic farm, and you'd see, the birds would feel safe landing there. The soil was alive. It wasn't just dirt holding the plants in place. And everybody would come back saying, okay, this is a pain. This is just as much a pain as it always was, but the company's doing the right thing, and we're going to help make this work. And I think there was a kind of milder version of that we also did with customer education, that really when you feel it, I mean, you can talk till you're blue in the face about 24% of pesticides being used on 8% of arable land and all that. But it's when you experience it with the kind of your nose, your mind, and your hands that creates the impetus to go through the trouble to make change. And by the way, just you want a little end of that story, when we did find a mill that could spin it. And the owner, it was one of the largest spinners in the world in Bangkok. And the owner, we asked him years later, we said, why did you even talk to us? Why did you go to the trouble to reduce the temperature on the factory floor in order to keep the cotton from gumming up? And he said, well, I guess you could call me a closet environmentalist. And so I think that's another thing for conscious businesses, always to look for the areas where you see a problem, you have the glimmer of a solution, and people love to do the right thing when they can.
I love that. People love to do the right thing when they can. Vincent, that's a good way to end our discussion. And I really appreciate the philosophy, the storytelling, and the practical side that you've brought to our conversation today. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you. And it was great to spend the time with you. So
thank you for the work you've done and the impact you've had and will continue to have. And we look forward to welcoming you to the CEO Summit in October.
Look forward to seeing you there. Okay.
Yes, and for our listeners, come to the CEO Summit in October, and you can hear Vincent Stanley talk some more about his experiences at Patagonia and get to interact with him personally there. So thank you, and on whatever channel you're listening to, if you feel so moved, hit the subscribe button or go over to Apple Podcasts, give us a rating and leave us some comments. We're always eager to hear. And thank you to Conscious Capitalism, Inc. for being our sponsor, and for Rainbow Productions for helping us to produce this show. And thank you, our audience. Go out there, be optimistic, and find a problem that you have agency to address. Be well.